We'll begin. It had been 40 years since I had heard his voice. 40 years, but I would recognize his voice anywhere. He was, not surprisingly, talking about the care that soldiers were getting returning from war. And that, not surprising, because he's a Vietnam War vet, and he was badly injured in the war. Lost a leg, lost an eye, and there's a big scar across the side of his face where the eye was. So he has personal history with dealing with the Vietnam War and the problems with getting care for the soldiers returning from war. But hearing his voice brought me back those 40 years to a time where we both worked for the University of Louisville Health Sciences Center. He was the director of the Cancer Center, and I was director of the Health Sciences Computer Center. And interestingly, his wife, who lived in Richmond, didn't come to Louisville with him. So he was alone most evenings after work, and my girlfriend, my fiance, was taking night classes. So he and I both had a lot of evenings free. So we went and we went through the town, through the bars and the restaurants, and had a good time and talked and talked. He told stories about almost dying on the battlefield and recurring times back at the hospital where he almost died again. He refused to die, and he's alive to this day. So he, in all those conversations in which he talked about that, and we talked about work, and we talked about the people we knew, not once did we talk about politics, or justice, or biases, or prejudice, or racism. Not once did any of those subjects come up. So then now I'm back in 2019 when I'm meeting him for the first time in 40 years at a restaurant in the South Side. And the subject of Monument Avenue comes up. 2019, that conversation was very different than it would be today. But it still was a conversation that was active on most Richmond area people's minds. So he told me, he said, "Steve, those monuments are good. They need to stay. They are good tourist attractions." And I agreed. I said, well, they are tourist attractions. That's true. They're attracting for all the wrong reasons. And it was clear to me at that point that our politics were really different. And it surprised me, shocked me really, that I hadn't figured that out in all those hundreds of conversations we had 40 years ago. But thinking about the differences we had about politics, about his going to war, brought me back even further, 1969. 1969, I was graduating with a master's degree from UCLA, and until then, I had a student deferment to stay out of the draft. Now, the draft in 1969 was based upon your birth date. My birthday, June 24, was number 150, which means there was 149 people with birth dates that are more vulnerable to be drafted than I was, and 215 people that were less likely to be drafted than I was. So I realized 150 is the good number, but it's not a great number. I knew that I would be vulnerable now that my student deferment was lapsed. So I thought about what to do about it and was looking for an advisor, a counselor, to talk about ways to avoid being drafted. Now I should say this was in large part because I considered, and I think history bears me out, that was an immoral war. It was not a war that we should have been in. So I wanted to avoid a war, not to be unpatriotic, but because it was the wrong war, and I wasn't going to fight in it. And in searching for a rabbi to marry me, that same little old man was also a counselor, an advisor for draft resistance. And he said the first thing you need to do when you get the notice to report to the draft board was to move. He said, don't have to really move, but just tell the draft board that you're moving. So when you get the notice to report to the draft board, report to a different draft board. So I was in Los Angeles. I got the notice early 1970, and I drove up to Berkeley. I had a bunch of friends in Berkeley, and I reported on that date to the Oakland Draft Board. And they said, okay, got this information down, got back in my car and drove back to Los Angeles. And that was good for 5-6 months. And then my friend got the notice that I was to report to the draft board in Oakland. And on that date, I reported to the draft board in Los Angeles. That was good for one round trip. The counselor says, you can't get away with this again. Once you can. So now I'm in trouble because short of moving to Canada, which I was not going to do unless there was no other resources. But I had a plan. I figured when I get my pre-induction physical, I had a plan. And the plan had to do with flatulence. I ended up with a bunch of food that created gas. That'll become obvious why I did that in a few minutes. Now, when you go into these induction physicals, you come away with one of 3 designations. You're a 1A, meaning you're good to be a soldier. You're a 4F, which means there's no way you can fight in this nation's army. Or a 1Y, meaning you didn't quite pass with flying colors, but you're not likely to be drafted anytime soon. So I went into the pre-induction physical. Let me walk you through it. So you go in the locker room, and the only thing you come out wearing out of that locker room is your shoes and your underpants. That's it. And you walk through, they take your blood pressure, they get a blood sample, they get a urine sample. They do all kinds of physical and a couple emotional psych exams. And the last exam that they gave us, there was 20 of us in our group, and they said, okay guys, go in a big circle, face inward. Now, bend over, drop your drawers, and spread your cheeks. And the inspectors went around all those 20 men looking into their backside. And they got to me, they said, hemorrhoids. And I said, Salzburg, sir. And they gave me my 1Y. Now, I guess I should explain the flatulence because my hemorrhoids have always been interior. The only way to get them out was with an accelerant. So I'm really pondering and wondering, how do I broach this conversation with Bill? Because I've got a second lunch date with him, and I'm thinking, how do I talk to him? Can I talk to him about this? What would the differences be like? Would it be a good conversation, a difficult one, a hostile one? And as I approached the parking space in the restaurant and then went into the restaurant and saw him sitting there, I realized only one thing I wanted to say to him. So I reached out my hand to grab his to shake it and says, Bill, I honor you and all men and women who have fought for our country. And it's been truly my pleasure to call myself your friend.